This is a story of empires. It is a story of ambition. It is a story of collapse. In this 5-part series, we will witness the final dramatic act in the life of the Western Roman Empire, seen through the eyes of the man who would bring it to its knees. He was a barbarian warrior, a Roman general, and a king of his people. His name was Alaric. This is his story. We begin not with fire and ruin, but with the quiet, deceptive calm that often precedes a great and terrible storm, a stillness in the political air of a world that believed itself to be eternal. The late 4th century was an age of profound and often violent transformation. The Roman Empire, a civilization that had dominated the known world for centuries, was showing deep and undeniable fractures. It was a behemoth, a colossal entity stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia. Yet this giant was ailing. Its sinews were strained by internal division, its coffers drained by endless wars, and its spirit wearied by political instability. The Roman world Alaric was born into was no longer a single, unified entity governed from one great capital. Decades of administrative and military challenges had led to a practical division. The empire was split into 2 halves: the East, the West, the Western Roman Empire. Rome, Milan, Ravenna faced immense immediate pressures. Frontier along the Rhine, frontier along the Danube borders under constant threat from migrating tribes seeking land, seeking wealth, seeking refuge. The Eastern Roman Empire governed from Constantinople, more stable and prosperous. Controlled Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt. Constantinople's strategic position, formidable walls, vital trade routes gave it resilience. The West bled resources defending borders. The East could afford diplomacy, payoffs to enemies, a professional, better-equipped army. This growing disparity created a rivalry between the 2 courts. The division was personified by the emperors themselves. 2 co-emperors, the Augusti, ruling East and West. In theory, colleagues presiding over one state. In practice, rivals. So, who were these people, the Goths, from whom Alaric would emerge? They were not a single monolithic nation, but a collection of Germanic tribes, who had migrated from the Baltic shores, down into the lands north of the Danube River and the Black Sea. For centuries they had lived on the edge of the Roman world, a constant and often troublesome presence. They were farmers and herders, but above all, they were formidable warriors. Roman writers often describe them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, noting their fierce martial spirit, their towering height, and their unwavering loyalty to their chosen chieftains. Their relationship with the Roman Empire was complex and had evolved over many generations. It was a cycle of conflict and trade, of raids and treaties. Sometimes Gothic tribes would launch devastating raids across the Danube, plundering Roman towns and farmlands. At other times, they would serve as mercenaries in Roman armies or engage in peaceful commerce, trading amber, furs, and slaves for Roman wine, grain, and manufactured goods. They were the barbarians at the gate, yet they were also a familiar, almost integral part of the Roman frontier ecosystem, a force to be managed, fought, or co-opted as circumstances required. A dramatic shift occurred in the late 300s and 70s. A new and terrifying force swept out of the vast steppes of Central Asia, the Huns. Displacing everyone in their path, huge numbers of Goths, primarily the Tervingi and Greuthungi branches, arrived at the Danube frontier, not as raiders, but as desperate refugees. They pleaded with the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the river and settle on Roman land, promising to serve in the army and live as loyal subjects of the empire. It was an unprecedented migration, a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions. After much hesitation, Valens agreed. But what followed was a catastrophic failure of Roman administration. Corrupt local officials exploited the starving Goths, stealing their food, enslaving their children, and treating them with contempt. Robbed of their dignity and pushed to the brink of starvation, the desperate Goths rose in rebellion. This culminated in the disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378, where a massive Roman army was annihilated and Emperor Valens himself was killed. The battle sent a shock wave across the empire. It proved unequivocally that the Goths were a force that could not be trifled with, a people who, if mistreated, could strike at the very heart of Roman power. In the aftermath of the shocking defeat at Adrianople, the new Eastern Emperor, Theodosius, was faced with a monumental problem. A large, victorious, hostile Gothic army was now roaming freely within the empire's borders. He could not defeat them militarily, nor could he expel them. A new solution was needed, one that would turn this threat into an asset. This was the system of the Foederati. Foederati comes from Latin foedus, meaning treaty. Theodosius made a deal with the Goths. In exchange for peace, they were granted land to settle in the Roman province of Thrace in the Balkans. They could live under their own laws and be governed by their own chieftains. Crucially, they were not disarmed or dispersed but remained a cohesive, semi-autonomous group. In return, the Goths had one obligation: fight for Rome as allied troops when called. On the surface, it seemed brilliant. Rome gained a large, ready pool of superb warriors without the cost of recruiting, training, and equipping new legions. These soldiers were fierce, experienced, motivated. They could plug gaps in overstretched defenses, bolster Roman armies in civil wars, and fight other barbarian incursions. The system let the empire outsource much of its defense, effectively hiring a permanent mercenary nation settled on Roman soil. However, Foederati had a fatal flaw. It created a powerful, armed, culturally distinct entity inside the state with no deep-rooted loyalty to Rome. Their allegiance wasn't to the Senate and people of Rome, but to their own leaders and to the emperor who paid and honored them. This created a permanent barbarian army inside the gates, a force whose loyalties could shift. If the treaty was broken, if pay was withheld, or if they felt disrespected, they could turn their weapons on the empire. It was a dangerous and precarious balance of power. Far from the gilded halls of Constantinople and the marble courts of Rome, a young man was coming of age. He was born not a Roman, but a Goth, a member of a so-called barbarian people who lived along the fringes of the empire. He knew little of the intricate dance of imperial politics, but he would learn. He would serve Rome, fight for it, and bleed for it. And in the end, he would be the one to expose its fatal weakness, not as an external enemy, but as a product of the empire's own flawed and failing system. Born around the year 370 on Puce Island, at the mouth of the Danube River, he was a member of the noble Balti dynasty of the Tervingi Goths. He would have grown up hearing the epic tales of his people's flight from the Huns, the crossing of the Great River, and the glorious, terrible victory at Adrianople. As a young nobleman, Alaric would have received the training expected of a future leader. He learned to ride a horse before he could properly walk, to wield a sword and a spear with deadly proficiency. He was immersed in the military culture of his people, a culture that prized courage, strength, and loyalty to one's kin and commander. But Alaric was also exposed to Roman civilization in a way previous generations of Goths had not been. Living within the empire's borders, he would have seen the paved roads, the stone aqueducts, the organized legions, and the vast administrative network that held the world together. This proximity to Roman power sparked a unique ambition within him. He was a Goth by birth, but his ambition was thoroughly Roman. The path to power for a talented Gothic warrior was clear: service in the Roman army. By distinguishing himself in battle, he could gain rank, wealth, and influence not just among his own people, but within the Roman military hierarchy itself. He saw Roman generals, men of immense power and prestige, and he aspired to be like them. Alaric's opportunity to prove his worth and advance his career came in the year 394. A civil war had erupted within the empire. In the west, a Roman general named Arbogast, a Frank by birth, had elevated a puppet emperor named Eugenius. This was a direct challenge to the authority of the legitimate emperor in the east, Theodosius. Determined to reunite the empire under his sole rule, Theodosius marshaled a massive army and marched west. As per the terms of the Foedus, the Gothic warriors were summoned to fulfill their duty. Alaric, now a rising commander in his early 20s, led a substantial contingent of his people. The two armies met at the Battle of the Frigidus River, in a cold mountain pass in modern-day Slovenia. Theodosius, a devout Christian, faced the forces of Eugenius, who had gained the support of the old pagan aristocracy in Rome. The battle was more than a mere struggle for power. It was seen by many as a final contest between Christianity and the old Roman gods. The fighting on the first day was brutal and inconclusive. Theodosius decided to use his Gothic Foederati as a spearhead, placing them in the vanguard to lead the assault against Arbogast's heavily entrenched forces. Alaric and his Goths fought with ferocious courage, throwing themselves against the enemy lines. But the position was strong, and the resistance was fierce. They suffered horrific casualties. According to some accounts, 10,000 Gothic warriors fell on that first day alone, a staggering loss for a people whose total numbers were not immense. Alaric watched as his men were cut down in droves. It was a bloodbath. As the sun set, the Goths were forced to pull back, their ranks decimated. Alaric survived, but the experience left an indelible mark on him. The next day, a sudden violent windstorm, which Theodosius' supporters would later claim was a sign of divine intervention, blew dust and arrows back into the faces of Eugenius' troops. This turned the tide of the battle. Theodosius' forces broke through, and the civil war was won. Theodosius was now the sole master of the entire Roman world, the last emperor who would ever rule over a fully united empire. Section 7. The Emperor is dead. With his victory at the Frigidus, Theodosius the Great had reached the zenith of his power. He had crushed his rivals. He had defended the Christian faith. He had united the sprawling empire under his singular command. He stood as the undisputed master of the Roman world. For a brief, shining moment, the old glory seemed restored. He had successfully managed the Gothic problem, integrated them into his army. From his perspective, the Foederati system was a resounding success. But that moment would be fleeting. In January of 395, while still in Milan celebrating his victory, Theodosius fell gravely ill and died. Close on the dying emperor with his sons at his side. He was only 48 years old. His sudden death sent a tremor of instability throughout the empire. The strong hand that had held the disparate and competing factions of the Roman world together was gone. The political landscape was instantly and irrevocably altered, creating a power vacuum that ambitious men would rush to fill. In his will, Theodosius formalized the division that had long existed in practice. He bequeathed the Roman world to his two young sons, Arcadius, 17, to rule in Constantinople, Honorius, 10, to rule in Milan. Neither son possessed the strength, experience, or charisma of their father. They were weak, indecisive youths, destined to become puppets in the hands of powerful advisors, generals, and court eunuchs who would govern in their names. The empire was now officially and permanently split. This division was not just administrative, it was the beginning of a deep and bitter rivalry. The two halves of the empire would no longer act in concert. Instead, they would view each other with suspicion and jealousy, often working at cross purposes. Stilicho in the west, Rufinus in the east. They would scheme against one another, hoard resources, and refuse to cooperate even in the face of common threats. The united empire of Theodosius was dead, replaced by two squabbling successor states. Section 8. A promise broken. In the wake of Theodosius's death and the division of the empire, Alaric and his surviving Goths waited. They had served loyally. They had bled profusely at the Frigidus. They had been instrumental in securing the victory that had placed Theodosius's dynasty in supreme command of the entire Roman world. Now they expected their reward. Alaric, having proven his skill and loyalty as a commander, anticipated a significant promotion within the Roman military hierarchy. He sought a high-ranking command, perhaps the coveted position of Magister Militum, Master of the Soldiers. The rewards, however, never came. The new courts, both in the east and the west, were consumed by their own internal power struggles. The powerful regent in the west, a Vandal Roman general named Stilicho, and his rival in the east, the Praetorian prefect Rufinus, were too busy maneuvering against each other to pay much attention to the promises made to a Gothic chieftain. Alaric's request for promotion was denied. The sacrifices of his people were ignored. Instead of being honored as heroes, the Goths were once again treated as inconvenient and potentially dangerous barbarians. This was the ultimate betrayal. Alaric had played by the rules of the Roman system. He had served the empire, risked his life for it, and led his men to slaughter in its name. He had aspired to a Roman career, believing that merit and loyalty would be recognized. The denial of his promotion was not just a personal slight, it was a clear and insulting message to all the Goths. It told them that no matter how bravely they fought or how loyally they served, they would never be seen as true Romans. They would always be outsiders, tools to be used and discarded. The fragile trust that Theodosius had carefully built with the Goths was shattered. The simmering resentment from the Frigidus now boiled over into open anger. The path of cooperation was closed. Section 9. The Proclamation of a King. Feeling betrayed, disrespected by the imperial courts, Alaric abandoned his post in the Roman army. He left Italy. He returned to his people, Moesia, Thrace. He brought news of Rome's ingratitude, fanning the flames of their discontent. The Goths had lost many at the Frigidus, then saw their leader cast aside. They were unified in anger. They had been used, now they were being forgotten. A moment of crisis and a moment of opportunity. They needed a leader for their cause. In a traditional Germanic ceremony, the warriors gathered, a people in search of purpose, an army in search of a war. They saw in Alaric their frustrations and their ambitions. He was a proven warrior, a skilled commander who knew the Roman way of war, a man personally wronged by the empire. They decided, a choice that would alter history. They lifted Alaric on a shield. They hailed him as their leader, their Rex. This transformed Alaric's status, no longer a Roman officer seeking promotion, now king of the Visigoths. His loyalty shifted to the men who raised him. Responsibility, secure a future for his nation. Find a permanent, secure homeland, land to farm and call their own. Win Rome's respect and recognition. His strategy came from seeing the empire's weaknesses. Honorius, Arcadius, Stilicho, Rufinus. He could play the halves against each other. Section 10. The march begins. With his new authority as king, Alaric did not hesitate. He led his people on a campaign of plunder and pressure, marching south from the Danube region into the Roman provinces of Macedonia, Greece. These lands, part of the Eastern Empire, were largely undefended. The bulk of the Eastern army was still in Italy with Stilicho. After the Battle of the Frigidus, Stilicho was reluctant to send them back to Constantinople. This left the wealthy cities of Greece exposed and vulnerable. Alaric's march was less of a war and more of massive armed extortion. His Visigoth army swept through the countryside, bypassing heavily fortified cities, sacking unprotected towns and villas. They marched through Thermopylae, a pass legendary for its defense, now undefended. They descended upon Athens. The city negotiated its surrender, paying a hefty ransom. Alaric and his chiefs were reportedly feasted by the city's leaders. Then, they moved on toward the Peloponnese Peninsula, sacking Corinth, Argos, Sparta. The campaign was a brutal but effective demonstration of power. Alaric was showing Constantinople the price of disrespect. He proved his Goths were a force that could not be ignored. The eastern court of Arcadius was furious, not only at Alaric, but at Stilicho in the west for withholding armies. The rivalry between east and west intensified, just as Alaric had calculated. He was no longer a pawn in their game. He was a player, manipulating the board. A product of the Roman system, a barbarian general trained in Roman tactics, now turned against his former masters. He did not yet seek to overthrow the empire. He sought to force his way back into the system. On his own terms, he wanted land, gold, a title, the things he had been denied. He was testing the frontiers, probing the weaknesses, measuring the resolve of the divided superpower that had made and betrayed him. The loyal soldier was gone, replaced by a formidable adversary. He had fought for Rome. Now he would test its strength. Enemy within, betrayals, bribery, the leaders who opened Rome's door.